Hello, folks, and welcome back to the channel. And in the first of two shows on World War II TV, Phil Craig joins us to talk about his new book, 1945, The Reckoning. I could hold it up, but I've only got the PDF, and it doesn't look quite so good. I haven't got a hard copy yet, but imagining I'm holding it up there. Great cover. Today, we'll be talking about Borneo, a country and campaign we just don't discuss enough when we talk about World War II, but I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Phil. How are you today?
There it is.
Yeah, I see you've got it.
That's
yeah, there we are.
Better than the PDF, don't you think, mate?
It does look much better than the PDF. Yeah. So we were just discussing before going live there that I've been surprised how well people have taken to discussions about 1945, because it's always felt a bit of the younger brother to 1944 in a sense of that.
No, you're right. Everybody thinks it's D-Day, it's crossing the Rhine, it's Hitler in his bunker, and then it's nuclear bombs in Japan, and then we're into the Cold War. I mean, that's kind of how people think. But it's an incredibly interesting year, and there's so much about it to discover and to reanalyze and think about. I was really surprised, actually, at some of the things I found. And I know you have a very specialized audience, a lot of experts, people listening to this who know more than I do. But a few things I could say about the book, I think, would actually genuinely surprise people. I'd be interested to know if people know about some of the stories I'd like to mention. Anyway.
And I think, the other thing is, which we'll get into as we get going, is that we have this idea of there are these two dates that we have in 1945, VE Day and VJ Day, as being somehow concluding things. And if there's one thing I learned from reading your PDF, it far from concludes things in certain parts of the world. It actually just opens up huge more discussions of future and empire and self-governance and who is going to be the main player moving forward. We talked about India when you joined my my channel a few weeks ago, and I think that's, to me, the thing that my takeaway is just it's concluding some chapters, but it's absolutely starting new chapters.
Yeah, it's very much. It's a year of endings, of course, but it's also a year of beginnings and a year of continuations. It's part of British pub wisdom, I think, that we beat Hitler and lost the empire. We bankrupted ourselves and lost the empire to win this war. And people say, was that good? Was that bad? But actually, do you know what? It's not really true. Policy making is very much influenced by hanging on to the empire. India is a separate case. But in the places we're going to talk about, especially in the Far East, the more profitable colonies, it's very much, forget what the Atlantic Charter said, forget the actual war aims that are being put out in all our propaganda. When it comes to it, we quite like to hang on to these places for a few more decades if we can. Yeah. And that doesn't really get told. But of course, it doesn't get told here. It gets told a lot in the places where the colonized people live.
Well, I mean, even the fact you just said Far East, as I always make the point, it's only Far East if you're starting in Birmingham or Manchester. If you're already living there, it's just where you live, So that,
of course,
even
and I think there's something in that. I know we're going to talk about Borneo in detail, but something we don't like to accept in Britain, and I dare say in Australia and other places too, which is that when the Japanese sweep through Asia in those amazing few months, the beginning of 42. For many people, it's a time of great celebration and hope. There's a thrill, there's an elation amongst people, because people who look like them are driving away the Brits, the French, the Dutch, the Americans, and the whole natural order of things that white people should run the world is suddenly, oh, does it have to be like this? And if the Japanese hadn't been so stupid and so cruel, they could have exploited that goodwill. And even though they were stupid and cruel, there was still quite a lot of goodwill for them in some places, and people prepared to fight for them and with them, as we saw with the Indian National Army and various Burmese militias and others. But you see, the genie's out of the bottle now. Even if Japan loses, and most people who've been colonized by Japan want them to lose, but even after that, the age of imperialism, the clock is ticking. The old colonial masters will not be welcomed back. And we see some very nasty things. We'll talk about these maybe in another day. In Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Indonesia, massive battles fought to put the colonial masters back. Yeah. Absolutely in contradiction of the Atlantic Charter and everything that was being talked about in the new documents of the United Nations. It's so interesting. And it sounds like a sour anti-imperial book. It's not. It's full of color and warmth and love and loss and heroism and great stories. It's the end of a trilogy that I call my love letter to that generation. So it's incredibly positive, actually, about what Britain and the British world achieves. But, for a fair reckoning, there's lots of stuff in there that we don't know enough about, of the darker side, and how the two link, how the two are intersecting. Anyway,
So let's give us a rundown of Borneo, because my first memory of Borneo is the Blue Peter visits to the old long huts back in whenever that was, with Leslie Judd and that back in the 1970s, and it's it's not something a country or a place I particularly think of when I'm thinking World War II. It's not, but of course it affected like it affected everyone else. So give us the thumbnail sketch of its.
Well, Borneo's a big place. The bit of Borneo that the British are very interested in is the bit where the oil is, and this is the bit they've run for a long time. It's Sarawak. It's Brunei. It's still a really wealthy place and has lots of resources. And they're a rather extraordinary family. The White Rajas, the Brooks, ran it on behalf of the Brits, and there were naval bases and things. But basically, it was about oil, and it was staffed largely by white people from Britain, from New Zealand, from Australia, and they brought in actually a lot of Malaysians and Chinese and Indians to work. The native population, the indigenous population, if you like, some of them were living on the coast where the oil is, where it says Brunei town, around there. But inside, in the hinterland, they were mostly tribal people, Dayaks, different kind. They were called Dayaks, and there were various different tribes of Dayaks, and they kind of sometimes fought wars against each other. They were, quite primitive, and they had these. They had, and this becomes relevant, for many, many years, practiced headhunting. And a lot of their cultural practices were about headhunting and the value of a head and the treatment of a head and the way that you display it and you preserve it and what it signifies about your status and your relationship with your gods. But by and large, they'd been left alone by the Brits. I mean, they lived a pretty simple life. We were much more interested in what was happening at the coast, which is where the money was being made. And there were nice golf clubs and tennis courts and people carrying trays with gins and tonic. And it was a lovely life. The Japanese wanted it too. Japan was terribly short of oil. It's a big factor in everything that happens in the Second World War. And the Japanese made for it and they grabbed it. And actually, I mentioned in many parts of the world, there was a certain amount of pleasure when the Japanese turned up. I don't think that's true in Borneo, actually. I think they were pretty unpleasant from the start and they made people very scared of them. But they also didn't really bother the Dayaks. They'd send the odd patrol. I mean, this is a huge place. Yeah. And this map makes it look tiny. It's massive. And most of the Dayak tribespeople, if they'd seen one Japanese soldier in 4 years of occupation, that was it. Very occasionally, there was one incident where I think an American plane had been shot down and somebody had tried to help the crew and they'd been arrested and massacred. And I think to the south of Borneo, there'd been some political agitation with Chinese people and they'd all been massacred, as well. So, the Japanese were not benign rulers, but by and large, they left the Dayaks alone. So the story I'm going to talk to you about tonight is this famous mission, one of many missions to Borneo. Well, this is perhaps the most famous one, Operation Semut. And it forms I think, quite an important part of the book, maybe about 8 to 10%. But it's important, I think, because it does show how these colonial agendas come to influence policy. It's also incredibly colourful and fun. Dark as well as fun. Can I just read you a little section?
Please do.
Just to give people a sense of the tone, because it is a fairly dark story. I do liken it a little bit to Heart of Darkness. By now, everyone knew the dire fate of prisoners. So when two soldiers became separated from their unit and heard foreign voices close by, they tried frantically to hide. But they were soon discovered by the riverbank. Their captors tied them to trees, then took turns to kick, punch and spit on them through a long and agonizing night. At first light, they were made to kneel, and then both were beheaded with a sword. It was a sadly common story of brutality during the war against Japan in the Indo-Pacific, except in this case, the soldiers were Japanese, and their captors were in a unit commanded by an officer of Australia's SRD. So that's kind of where this goes. It goes to a kind of a war of massacres and ambushes and very chaotic, and it goes on long after the actual war is over. These dudes are the SRD, Services Reconnaissance Department. They're Australia's version of the SOE.
Yeah.
And actually that's relevant too, because it turns out that they are very heavily influenced by British officers at the senior levels of the SRD. And it's never quite clear. And there's a lot in this story that's never quite clear because it's a secret world we're talking about. Mm. And the various historians have dug into various files over the years and people still don't really know why certain decisions were made. And there's talk actually in the official documents of necessary chicanery to hide what's being done. And there's even talk about destroying documents. That's partly because they do things that are against the Geneva Convention, and they don't want the world to know. Anyway, the SRD is a Australian younger brother, smaller brother of the British SOE, probably really effectively controlled from London, even though many of the men who serve in it, who are mostly Australians, some New Zealanders, they probably don't know that. And they're sent on a mission, which starts in March 45. And it's one of those, and there was a very lively debate about this in Australia in the years after the war. The debate sort of went away, but there was a lot of people questioning why there were these campaigns on some of these islands in March, April, May. By now, the real game is the home islands of Japan. The Philippines have gone. MacArthur's moving north. The Americans are preparing to invade. Nobody knows about the atom bomb, but the really big game is the home islands. By this time, the Japanese have virtually no navy, no air force. So their garrisons on these islands are kind of just sitting there, not able to do anything. They can't send any oil out. They can't get any food in. I mean, some of them are running out of food and they start stealing it from the locals, which is a problem. But by and large, they're sitting there doing nothing and everybody's waiting for the war to end. Nobody knows when it will end, but it's clearly in its final stages.
Yep. Yep.
And there was a famous Australian historian who wrote this, actually. He wrote this about the Bougainville campaign, which happens in July and August, before too, saying it was a terrible loss of life. Australians lose, I think they lose like 1,000 people there. And lots of locals die in this battle in this island. A terrible loss of life, civilian and military, for an island whose possession was of no consequence in bringing the war to a close. The Australian soldiers performed so well when they had to know that what they were doing was in the larger sphere unnecessary and unappreciated, says much for the courage and discipline of the ordinary Australian soldier. And Borneo is a bit like this. There was quite a debate about whether it was necessary to go in there. Why are we going in there? Well, lots of documents get examined in the years after the war. Some are destroyed, but some are examined, and some people give interviews. And it's quite clear what's really happening here is a mission to secure economic resources and restore the British administration. Like I say, forget the Atlantic Charter and its promises of self-determination, liberation. Everybody has the right to their own government, to choose their own government. We are going back for those oil fields, guys. And we're going to do it in a slightly sort of under the counterfeit way, because this island, Borneo, is under MacArthur, not Mountbatten. It's not in Mountbatten's patch. It's MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area. And they had a joke about the British. Mountbatten's lot with the Southeast Asia, SEAC. And all the Americans used to joke that really should stand for Save England's Asian Colonies, because they thought that's all the Brits cared about, which is unfair, but you can understand maybe why they thought that. Now, MacArthur had to give the go-ahead for this mission in Borneo. So first of all, it was presented as an Australian mission, which it kind of wasn't. And then it was also presented as a very important fact-finding mission to help the Americans in the Philippines and to provide useful information about the naval movements. But the documents that they're passing each other and the things that they're talking about, it's more like, well, I'll give you a quote. The real object of the mission is the softening of the local inhabitants and arrangements so the colonial office and the ex-government can resume once it's been liberated. We have not told MacArthur's team this, as these are matters in which they would not have any interest. It's interesting, isn't it? He was the man who runs it is actually a New Zealander, especially recruited Toby Carter. He's the man on the ground running it. I was sent to investigate the internal political situation and ascertain the feelings of the natives towards the pre-war government and the possible return of the White Rajas and or British administrators, setting up spheres of influence to avoid problems when we resume our activities there. Now, a lot of people in London are also talking about the need to save face, the need to kind of continue flying the flag. There's injured pride. The Brits have been kicked out of these places. They want them back. And there's economic pressure. But we will get to this in a minute. But there's another thing a lot of viewers of this program will know about, and that's Sandakan. Yeah. Especially Australian viewers. Sandakan is a notorious death march from a camp not far from where this operation takes place. And the SRD are considering and planning a mission for Sandakan to rescue the men there. 2,500 men. You know how many survived? 6. 6 survive. It's one of the most appalling atrocities the Japanese commit. SRD know all about it. They have spies all over the island, a very effective network. And they make a plan to try and go in there and save these men. They're mostly Australian, there's some Brits. It's based on a thing the Americans do in the Philippines, a camp called Los Banos. Similar deal. They rescue about, I think, 2,000. And, you know, at this point, the Allies have total superiority in the air and on the water. So there's at least a chance they'll rescue some of these people. But that, and this causes a very big row in Australian politics in the years after the war. Although, again, that's disappeared now into the memory hole. They officially deprioritize the plan, Operation Kingfisher, to go and try and save these guys, in order to do this plan, Semut, which it seems to be about oil fields, not rescuing your mates and your comrades. That doesn't go down too well to the average Australian, especially if you've lost relatives in Sandakan. Mm-hmm. So there's a big political background to all of this. And anyway, this I don't think this is taken from Borneo, but this is a shot of SRD men. And they were all larrikins. That was a great Australian phrase. They tended to recruit people who were irreverent, you know, didn't hold with military bull, you know, took responsibility. They're slightly wild and crazy, but like RSAS in that respect. But amazing characters. And the book is full of some of the really colourful stories and accounts of what they did in Borneo, which wasn't all bad, by the way.
Yes, we had a comment earlier, Phil, from Terry about MacArthur was not wild about having the Australian troops in on the invasion of Japan. The Australian army was looking for a role. How much of the fact that Australia is sort of being pushed to the touch a little bit by 1945, that they want to just, okay, in a small involvement by this group of sort of insurgents, but they do want to kind of keep their hand in this war, because otherwise they'll be like the French still being involved in pushing towards Berchtesgaden and the Vosges, because they want to have a seat at the victory table after victory's been declared. How much do you think it's important for Australia to just keep being involved in whatever shape or form, like when the Canadians are pressing to get involved in any shape or form back in 41?
Well, it's a good question, and I think one of the reasons that the mission is approved, I think, is that the people running SRD quite like doing this sort of thing. It's what they're trained for. It's cloak and dagger. It's moonlit canoe rides. Yeah. It's secret raids. It's parachute drops, flying boats coming down at night into rivers. It's quite exciting. The people running Australia are quite war weary by now, to be honest. And when the actual invasion comes, we'll get to that, they're very keen not to do some of the things that these guys were sent to do. So they just sit on the oil fields and they don't move. And the reason for that is revealed in political papers later, that, you know, it's obvious, very obvious now the war is ending. We don't want to lose any more men. You know, what's the point? So there's a certain amount of war weariness. I do think that the people that were really gung-ho for this operation, some of them were Australians, but mostly they were British, and they were operating to a colonial agenda. Anyway, I'm taking too long to get to the point. They land deep in enemy territory. It's a great photograph. That is actually parachutes going down into Borneo. And I think one of them is what they called a torpedo, which was like a thin cylinder with guns and supplies in. So they parachute them in, and they set out to meet the Dayak tribes. And the very first meeting, I'm going to just read one little section because it's funny and also, I hope, impactful. If anybody's offended by bad language, please mute now. On 25th March 1945, the engines of Liberator bombers were not the only thing making unfamiliar noises high on the Kelabit Plateau. Fuck 'em all, fuck 'em all, the long and the short and the tall. Fuck all the sergeants and WO1s, fuck all the corporals and fuck all their mums. Few of the men and women swaying and cheering in the longhouse understood the words, but they clearly grasped the sentiment as the men of Semut 2 celebrated a day that had gone better than any of them had expected. After many rounds of borak, the potent local rice wine, their hosts had stood up to sing traditional Dayak praising songs in honor of their new guests, each accompanied by an obligatory toast. And so it seemed like simple good manners to respond in the finest tradition of the Australian army. 'Cause we're saying fuck off to 'em all, as back to their billets they crawl. There's fuck all promotion this side of the ocean. So cheer up, my lads, fuck 'em all. Toby Carter would have been proud of them. Yeah. So they're laying out, this is important, they're laying out various promises. If you work with us, if you fight with us, if you give us information and you act as our guides, we will help you drive the Japanese away. And if the Japanese come after you, which is the obvious question, we will protect you, and there's an invasion coming, and we will, these men coming from the sea will come and save you from the Japanese. This is the promise that's made. But as I say, this is the last bit I'll read, I promise. It was an impressive and persuasive pitch, although unfortunately and wholly unknown to the men singing late into the night high on the Kelabit Plateau. Some of its most important points and promises would turn out to be worth fuck all.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. I mean, there's a lot. We're rushing through a little bit. They do recruit their allies. They have all sorts of adventures. It's very colourful. And they form terrific bonds. You know, there's a lot of respect between these two very different cultures. I mean, the Australians think they're going to teach the Dayaks how to fight and give them modern weapons. Fine. But they end up relying on the Dayaks for everything. Medical help, navigation. I mean, just getting, they made assumptions of how fast they could travel in a day. And it was like the Dayaks looking at them like, are you serious? It's a fabulous, but also very dangerous place. Lots of wildlife, lots of things trying to bite you, lots of diseases you can catch. And it's canoe rides, and it's high in the mountains with incredible clouds of butterflies. And it's very dramatic and lovely, actually. And there's a lot of respect for the Dayaks from the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Brits.
How we had a question from John Sowerby about what was the Dayak experience with the Japanese? You said that if you were a Dayak and you'd seen a Japanese soldier once in 4 years, that was kind of that was par for the course. And you said they had been reasonably cruel when they arrived there. But I mean, did they need much convincing, these guys, that the Japanese were cruel?
Well, no, they didn't. They were frightened of the Japanese because the Japanese had carried out summary executions of people who were maybe helping the American crew that crash landed or bailed out of a plane. Well, it's an interesting one because this guy in this picture, actually, Tanga Veng, that's Toby Carter, the New Zealander. He was picked because he knew the languages. He'd worked in the oil fields and he'd made it his business to learn about the interior peoples. And this guy, Taraman, actually was a friend of his. And they they could speak in both Dayak and Malay together. So he's a key leader. After various adventures, they get to him, and he has the kind of swing vote, really, for all the people on the Baram River, which is where most of the action takes place. And he has played a very sophisticated game. He's entertained the Japanese. They've been in his longhouse. They've drunk rice wine and sang songs with the Japanese. His priority was to keep his people safe. You know, he's scared of the Japanese, scared of them, but didn't want to go out of his way to provoke them. So there was a better respect. So he took some convincing, and the main argument deployed is that we will give you protection. Because, you know, we're talking about a couple of hundred SRD people. No, not even 100. And maybe a couple of thousand militias armed, some of them with modern weapons, but often you saw those swords, those parangs. Yeah. And sometimes they had like hunting rifles from like the 19th century, you know. So they were good for doing harassing raids and gathering intelligence and laying ambushes. But if a battalion of Japanese soldiers comes after a community like that, it's going to be a massacre.
Yeah.
And they were worried about that. So Toby Carter and his friends and his men make all these promises, which, as I say, turned out to be worth rather less than they hoped.
But do you think Carter would be aware that he's promising things that aren't necessarily going to? Because you know, you said he's familiar with the area, he speaks the languages there, but is he being lied to as well by his?
Yes, and that's why he ends up being fired in the middle of all this, and he writes some very passionate things about it. But the other thing that I haven't mentioned, which is really important, and this is why a lot of the papers were destroyed, one assumes. They offered to pay the Dayaks for Japanese heads. And this is electrifying. I mean, this is a big part of Dayak culture. And we may all find it kind of shocking that such things happen. But I think, as I say in the book, you know, we're talking about a global war where people are being blown to pieces in all kinds of ways. So removing a head from a dead soldier, it doesn't seem that different from, you know, dropping a bomb on a house, does it really? Obviously, it's mistreating casualties is against the Geneva Convention, which is why they didn't talk about it much. But they all admitted it. Carter himself admits it. And this was a very powerful inducement, not so much the money, but the fact that it would be permitted, because for the previous, I think, 80 or 90 years, it had been banned. They'd really tried to stamp it out. I mean, obviously, now that the Japanese were there, I guess the Dayaks were probably doing it quietly anyway. But now suddenly it was supercharged, and that sent like a ripple of electricity along this whole valley. And young men, who dreamt of the honor of taking a head, came along to volunteer. And there's some very, very gory descriptions of where they do get into these small battles. Some of the Australians, they suddenly turn around and they see, what was it? One of his Dayak mates carrying two heads with his fingers coming through their mouths like you're carrying a fish from its gills. And there's great celebration, and they have more dancing and more singing, more borak drunk, more songs, and they do the rituals with the heads. And it's a big part of it, why they, I think, supported the Australians in this mission.
It's saying a lot, isn't it? Because as we start this conversation, it's a first attempt by the whites to sort of say to these people, we are going to allow you to move forward with your traditions, your idea of, we've outlawed this under our rule, but now we need you now, so we're going to let you do it, and actually we're going to pay you for it. It's on the one hand it's barbaric, but it's also conceding a bit to the locals, isn't it?
It's also a Pandora's box, because as things spin out of control, which we'll get to in a minute, the various bands of Dayaks start peeling off, and a Chinese head looks very much like a Japanese head to a white Englishman or a New Zealander, and so they start killing people, sometimes civilians, just because they want the heads and they think they'll be paid for them. So that's a very murky part of the story. I mean, this is where it really just goes proper heart of darkness at this point. So they're stirring up this jungle war, whether it was necessary or not. Historians don't agree, can't agree. They're stirring it up, and then the big thing is, they're successful. But they have these missions. They're very dramatic. The Japanese don't know where they are. They start sending patrols. They hide from them. I mean, it goes well, and then the invasion comes. And I think we've got a slide. There's some great photographs of the invasion. It's a real proper D-Day type picture. I think that is the Australians landing in Borneo. It looks like it might have been faked, though, doesn't it, that picture? I'm not sure. It's too perfect. Anyway.
Set up slightly, possibly, a bit later in the day, maybe.
It's from the Aussie War Museum, and they're normally very good. But still, so they land in large numbers, the 9th Division, and they have their little battles on the coast. And the Japanese, basically, they did put up some resistance. I mean, there's proper battles, but a lot of the Japanese move inland, probably in search of better defensive positions. But that brings many thousands of Japanese soldiers right into the area where the Dayaks are with the SRD. And they start really going after them because they're angry now. They're really angry. And so they start burning longhouses, stealing food, killing people. And so Toby Carter and his mates start sending messages to the commanders of the 9th Division. Well, we're here, we're waiting for you. And we made all these promises. And it's like, nobody told us. That's not in our orders. And we're not doing it. And there's a kind of Anglo-Australian relationships. They're not always easy, let's be honest. Certainly when it comes to military affairs. Proud Australians don't like being told. One of Toby Carter's main deputies is a guy called Tom Harrison, amazing character. Not the easiest man to get along with. He starts sending these very angry messages to these Australians saying, you're not doing your duty, it's a disgrace, we've made these promises, where are you? And the Australians are like, well, who are these Brits telling us what to do? We answer to the government in Canberra, thank you very much. And they have told us to stay here, grab these places and do nothing else. And that leads to a really big shouting match and arguments and people fly in and out. And eventually Carter's fired. And he's fired basically for caring too much about the Dayaks. He wants to sort of get them food and get them security. And a lot of the other people in the organization and elsewhere are like, well, why? They've done their bit now. So, in the great scheme of things, a few thousand civilians get caught up in a nasty little jungle war. It's a shame, but it's not. We were not told about this. So there's been a kind of breakdown in communications. There's been a mismatch of mission parameters, all the phrases people use when things start to unravel, and it does unravel. And there are these very nasty. I mentioned about the Japanese prisoners being beheaded. There's these war bands, and the Japanese themselves are fracturing into different bands. Some of them want to surrender. Some of them want to keep fighting. Some of them just seem to want to kind of go on a kind of pillaging and looting spree. And it gets very, very nasty. And then finally, the guy that takes over from him, he does get the Australian Air Force to come in to offer some support. And in almost every case, they bomb the wrong place. The intelligence is wrong. So they're also now killing Dayaks by mistake. There's a lovely moment. You think I'm obsessed with the F word, where the SRD men, there's a longhouse where all the civilians have gathered, and it has been machine gunned by their mates from the Australian Air Force. They cut out sheets or white cloth and they write on the word "fuck off" on the ground so the pilots will see it. But it all gets a bit like that. It gets really messy and really nasty, and it goes on way after the war's over. And the Japanese maybe don't know the war's over because they're no longer in communication with anybody, probably. But also they've got themselves involved in these kind of massacres and counter massacres with these groups, and they're not so pleased that people are hunting their heads either. And angry Japanese soldiers are pretty fearsome things. So it all unravels. And the thing about it that I still can't get my head around is how it was ever meant to help restore the Brits. Surely the invasion was enough. It doesn't seem to provide a huge amount of help to anybody planning the invasion. In fact, the people planning the invasion seem to regard them as just a bunch of marauding buccaneers. I mean, there's a great scene where another of these jungle clearings, one of the guys from the 9th Division turns up, and they're about to execute somebody who they think is a collaborator. And they drag this guy out in front of, officers of the Australian Army and chop his head off. And it's like, well, where was the trial? Where's the process? Oh, well, it's the jungle, mate. No. He then orders the arrest of the SRD men, and he wants to have them court-martialed. And it all goes all the way up to General Blamey, the big chief of the Australian Army. And he actually says, no, let this one slide. So there's lots of things happening that are very ugly. And there's not really a shooting match between SRD and the Aussie Army, but it gets pretty close. They're not happy with each other at all. And then, of course, the Sandakan. I mentioned that there was a big plan to try and send a mission to Sandakan, which is a site of just some of the most awful things that really are of the war. Just everything terrible happens there. And, after the war, Blamey, who's no longer in the army, puts out this statement saying, yes, because, people have come out of the camps and told their stories, and the Australian public know about them. The globe, the people around the world are fascinated, obsessed with these terrible tales. And people say, well, why was nothing done? Could anything have been done to help the men in Sandakan? And Blamey puts out a statement saying, well, we did have a plan, actually, but, we couldn't really get the support in Canberra, and the Americans weren't being very friendly with giving us the transport aircraft, so we couldn't do it. And there is an absolute explosion. I mean, Australian politics is brutal at the best of times. The Prime Minister, Shifley, I think his name, puts out this amazing statement saying, well, if the general, we've checked now all the correspondence, because we're getting letters and phone calls from the relatives of these dead people saying, what the hell? And we've checked all the correspondence. And if General Blamey was so keen on this plan, he might once have mentioned it in any correspondence to anybody in Canberra, because he didn't, not once. Wow. So that's quite interesting. So there's a big blame game. People know that something not quite right has happened here. Now, there's a very good historian, Paul Hamm. I don't know if you've come across him.
If you hadn't mentioned him, I was going to mention him. Yeah,
right.
I mean, he came on and talked about the dropping of the A-bombs, and he wrote, as I'm sure you've read it, an incredible book about Sandakan. He basically said, I spent 10 years of my life studying that. I can't even talk about it now. It just upsets him so much, both the brutality and the fallout and the blame and the politics. And he said, because I said, I'd love you to come on and talk about it. He said, no, I'm not. No, that was 10 years of my life that I'm still kind of dealing with.
Well, that's interesting, because he actually thinks, and I have read his book, it's brilliant. I recommend it to anybody. He actually thinks that the Operation Kingfisher probably was never going to be successful had it been attempted. He actually said, he wrote a book, said he didn't think he was in a state to proceed. And it would have required a much higher degree of focus and a much higher place in the priority list to have had any chance of saving those men's lives. And sadly, it never had either of those things. But of course, he probably didn't know when he wrote that the mission that was prioritized was so kind of compromised by all this colonial stuff. And there's another Australian, Gary Followill. You've come across him?
No.
He wrote a research paper. I'm going to have to find this. Wait. Here we are. Oh yes, he looked into the papers as well. This was about, I think it was the early parts of the century. He looked into the paperwork about the political relationship between SRD and Canberra. And he says, I'm afraid this research has led me to pose an inescapable question to Australians past and present. At what stage in the Second World War did the re-establishment of government control in Asian colonies become more important than the lives of Australian and British prisoners of war?
Wow.
Which is a big question. And like I say, I've not written a sour book. It's not empire bashing. There's lots of things in the book that are very positive. You know, it is my love letter to that generation. And we talk about other stories too that are much more straightforward. But this dark side is, you need to know about it because other people do. And it affects the way they see us and saw us. And the British especially, you know, we are so in love with the idea that we're the underdog in the Second World War. The Blitz, the Battle of Britain, Dunkirk, rationing.
We're the underdog, and that we always are on the side of right. Everything we do is noble, and it mostly is. I mean,
a lot of yes, it is mostly. And these two things are symbiotic because it's only the fact that Britain has an empire, and the power of that empire, the resources, the manpower, the scale of it. It's only that only allows us to go and liberate Belsen. You know, the two things they feed into and off each other. And yes, but in the outside world, we were never seen as an underdog. We were seen as an overdog. You know, a bully sometimes. Certainly a forceful presence, not to be trifled with. This is a tragic picture. This is after the war, the Australian forensic team following the routes of the marches, the death marches, trying to find bits of human bodies, basically, to identify them. So you can see all this in the papers in the years after the end of the war. And then suddenly somebody said, but didn't we have a mission? We did, didn't we? Why was that cancelled? And big explosion. But again, forgotten about now. I'd be surprised if even in Australia, 1% of people know. But I keep finding stories. I was going to do a little straw poll. I mean, I know we're not really talking about Vietnam and Indonesia in this episode.
Till next time. Yeah.
But, you know, I would wonder how many of your loyal audience, who are very well read, how many of them know that Japanese prisoners of war in their thousands were released, given weapons, and sent into battle by the British in the months after in the final months of 1945, sent into battle sometimes against people who thought they were our allies, in order to put the French back into Indochina and the Dutch back into the East Indies. Well, Mountbatten flies into Jakarta. And he lands, this car takes him from the airport to the HQ, and he's looking out the window, and there are all these Japanese soldiers with rifles guarding the route. And he says to his mate, didn't we just spend the last 4 years fighting these buggers? And this is also at the time when all of the stories of the death camps are coming out and the marches. And there we are, you know, run the flag up the old pole again with the help of some Japanese prisoners of war. Jolly good show.
Well, that's how we began this discussion, by saying that the boundaries of when exactly the war ends are very loose in that part of the world. The legacies are very different. Everybody comes out of it with different aspirations and different ideas. And during your process of writing the book, and now the process of plugging it and selling it and talking about it, did your notions about that part of the world particularly change? I'm assuming they did during the process. And have you come to any sort of strong conclusions about things that should have been done or were handled badly, or do you just kind of put it all down to the kind of the vagaries and the randomness of how wars go?
I think Britain was an empire. Britain thought in imperial terms. Britain thought in racialized terms, and that includes the government that's in power during some of these operations, the Labour government that comes into power. Some of the things Attlee said about, you know, it's the white man's burden view, that it was natural for Europeans to control the fate of foreign states, of non-white people. And for all the talk of partnerships in the Commonwealth, somebody at the time said, well, a partnership could be defined as one between the rider and a horse. And I'm afraid those attitudes did persist. I mean, it was not a surprise to me that they did. I mean, you look at Chips Channon diaries. I mean, there's a lot of kind of nasty and bigoted and pretty horrible prejudice deep in the kind of ruling class. And we knew that, but I didn't really quite grasp the level of cynicism at some of the operations, certainly in the Far East, which did surprise me. And I guess also this is pub wisdom, isn't it? That the end of the war was the end of the empire, but it absolutely wasn't. And maybe not, nor could it have been, given the economic pressures that Britain was under. Thank you, America, for that. There was going to be competition with America, and also an enormous loan that had to be repaid. And wasn't it only 5 years ago it was finally paid off?
It wasn't long ago, was it? Yeah.
You know, the Malaya, for example, which is also seized peremptorily without any concern for the Atlantic Charter. Malaya in the 50s basically keeps Britain going. I mean, it's the biggest source of foreign currency for the whole of Britain is Malayan rubber. So this is big stuff. And even if you might be a socialist, but you're looking at the balance sheet and you're thinking, well, couldn't we just keep this going for a few more years? And then we'll have a conference and talk about a handover process. And that's
the Malaya campaign, was it 48 to 1960 or something? It's I think it's our longest campaign of the 20th century or something, isn't it? You know, and it's national servicemen going out there and Virgin Soldiers, the great novel and film there about that.
Yeah, my father didn't go, but he was slated. He was a national service.
Yeah, my dad missed it by about 2 months. He was just the national service stopped when he would have gone, but they stopped it and he didn't go in the end. But so with as we bring things to an end, you're going to come back and talk about Vietnam and Indonesia and things in the next show. But Borneo, what's the legacy there? Because we always talk on this channel about every country.
Can't I have a third one, Paul? Indian Army. Now we need to talk about the Indian Army.
We could do that as well. But I mean, you know, we talk about France's journey and understanding and its collaboration aspect and its resistance aspect, and Britain and the myths of the Britain alone in 1940 thing, America and its greatest generation. Every country has been dealing with it, but differently. And you know, you mentioned there's still oil, there's still wealth there. Brunei now, but what, you know, Borneo and its vision of how does Borneo, I mean, you can't speak for a huge country, but what is who could sum up the legacy? What would you say the legacy is in that part of the world of the war? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? What do they think?
Well, I think, you know, it's interesting in Indonesia. I'll talk about Indonesia next time. I think that the war is remembered there in a very different way to the way it's remembered here.
Yeah.
The Japanese are not seen quite. I mean, they are obviously the places where they committed atrocities. They're seen as terrible, but it's still remembered as a glorious moment when the colonists were driven out in many places by many people. A moment of hope. The idea that, you know, you didn't need to be controlled by a foreign power to develop your nation. What's it called? The greater co-prosperity sphere. I mean, a lot of it was propaganda, rubbish, but the fact that it worked for so long showed you the need for it and the desire for it.
Yeah,
I think it's remembered as a tragedy, really. I mean, deep down, global powers from other places are fighting a horrible war on your land, and you're getting killed, and your farms being destroyed, and your animals.
And they're essentially only fighting over your resources, not you really as a people. Whereas, you know, when we're talking about the ETO, there is much more of a sense of liberating peoples from tyranny. Whereas at that part of the world, you know, as you said, it's oil and rubber, the two big things, and metals, things like that. It is more or less these people just happen to be in the way of. Well, it was their resources. I mean, let's be honest. It was their resources that the whites and the Japanese are basically fighting over, and
that's correct.
And they are collateral damage of that wider campaign.
But I think it also is the birth of nationalism had been building throughout the world in the decades prior to the Second World War, of course. But it's the sense that we really now are entering the final chapter. That, you know, even if the French come back, they'll be. Yeah. They're not going to last forever. You know, the Dutch actually don't last that long in Indonesia either. We hang on to Borneo for another 15 years, make a lot of money, then we leave, still good friends. Malaya, well, it's a very different story in Malaya, but one for another day maybe.
I think it's just about being quizzical, looking at it and looking at where the league tables of where the good guys and bad guys rate vary as you move around the world. And, you know, when we've been talking this week about liberating Belsen, clearly going in there, the Brits become the good guys. The Canadians, the day later, are the good guys bringing freedom to those 60,000 people. But in Borneo, as you said, the gap between the Japanese and the British and Australians is perhaps a little bit closer than we'd like to admit it is.
That's very good. That's a very good way of putting it. I mean, your friend Robin Pryor, by the way, I should thank you. You know, you and your audience and your network has helped me so much with this book. I've met many people through this podcast, Robin Pryor being one of them.
And I'm jealous of the fact you had to have lunch with him and dinner, and I haven't met him yet, but he's supposed to be coming to Europe at some point. But we will leave this discussion now, and we will pick it up again when you come back and continue when we talk about Vietnam and Indonesia.
Yes, that'll be my pleasure. And I've lots more.
In the meantime, folks, you've got the links to the book in the description below. You can buy it at your favorite bookstore or on live. The book launch was last night, which was successful by all accounts. So
that's why I'm drinking water today.
Go and get the book. So cheers, everybody. I will see you all again tomorrow when we're talking about Greenland. So that'll be a good one. So cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Thanks guys.
Bye.